And now I get to introduce Caroline Sinders, who unfortunately can't be with us today. We had a long discussion about whether it was appropriate to say she can't be here because she has long COVID. Decided we shouldn't say that, and then realized that it was the first line in her recorded talk. So we're not giving away any spoilers. So Caroline Sinders is an award-winning critical designer. She works in between AI, intersectional justice, systems design, harm, and politics, and has a design research agency called Provocations Design and Research that looks at communication problems and how to do design for public good. She's worked with many. Did I hear something? No. She's worked with many major organizations, United Nations, Amnesty International, and has fellowships at Harvard, Google's People and AI Research Group, and her work's been shown at Tate Modern, V&A, MoMA, and all sorts of other exciting places. For me personally, I got to know Caroline's work through the feminist data set and this really detailed practice of looking at where data comes from and how it's labeled and how we might rethink these things. And also some of her work with the experiential AI group, where she's trying to use critical creative practice to highlight things that go on inside AI systems and make visible a lot of the things that are not always seen. And to me, this is one of the really important things that we can do as designers, is this visibility and legibility. So I'm really excited to see what she's going to talk about in the talk through speculative and critical design practices and see how this unfolds. So hopefully if I press this button, it should start a video. Hello, Caroline.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I wish I could be there in person, but I am battling long COVID and now also a cold, so you may hear me coughing or having to pause to get water during my presentation. But anyway, thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to give my presentation. So let's get started. Here we go. So design impacting policy. Hi, I'm Caroline Sinders. How does design impact policy? So design policy looks at the role of design in products and software and how designers make things, and then analyze how design terms and the structures of design operate in relationship to policy and technology. Design does impact policy in a variety of different ways. That's why we have seatbelts that are shaped certain ways due to an open source patent. It's why we have things like calories listed and ingredients listed on things like packages, and it's why we have things like the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's also why we have similar disability laws throughout Europe. But a way then that digital design also then impacts policies is how what I am going to argue in this presentation is how design principles in software sort of interpret or create software, and how that then has a downstream effect on policy. For example, most digital design follows the principles of human-centered design, a design methodology created in the 1990s that focuses on user experience. These methodologies are, for example, a person in Croatia can use an app designed in India and understand how to use that app. So design policy is the act of using design to make policies around software and hardware more understandable. As I've said before, we have different examples of that in the physical world, and this is just an extension into the digital world. But how design impacts policy, I think we can most clearly see in things like dark patterns, which are design patterns that unintentionally or intentionally manipulate users into making decisions they normally wouldn't make. Dark patterns as a term was coined by designer Harry Bringle in 2010. And it really started to gain popularity in pop culture and a more general understanding outside of the design world, and particularly started to have policymakers pay attention in 2019, because that's when ProPublica reported on something called TurboTax. TurboTax suppressed its free version, tricking people into paying to file their taxes. Primarily, the free version of TurboTax was actually designed for veterans and for people living under a certain socioeconomic level. ProPublica found that there was no way to actually access the free the free version of it. And that same year, that's when Princeton University launched a project that discovered over 1,000 different instances of similar tricks, i.e. dark patterns, implemented across a few thousand e-commerce websites. I think of dark patterns as being both intentional and unintentional. And I include that in my definition because intent is really hard to prove in a court of law, but also really hard to find a smoking gun. But even that things that feel intentional, right? Like, how do we know it's intentional? For example, is it an intentional dark pattern to suppress privacy when social networks bury their security settings, or are designers and engineers not sure where to place the appropriate buttons? Is it intentional that marketplaces like Amazon have price confusion, or again, is it just bad design? And I think it can be both. What matters here is not unpacking direct intent, but rather looking at the outcomes and harms of these design decisions, and then creating policy that accounts for these decisions. What's important to realize about design is that it's a utilitarian intelligence, taking engineering, code, and policy and creating something that feels understandable to users. Design can elevate and obfuscate. Design isn't just a skill, but a practice and a language in and of itself. And it starts solving problems around complex issues, but also creating spaces for human connection. Design needs to be at the equal forefront of this conversation. Design is what distills code and policy into digestible and interactive interfaces for users. Design is the thing that explains what the code and policy are outlining. So for issues like labor, harassment, security, and privacy, design is incredibly important. We can see design interpreting or directly affecting policy in things like online harassment porting interstitials, which I think is a great example. Ideally, users don't have to deeply understand a social network's policy on harassment in order to report it. Design takes the technical infrastructure, the ability to select a piece of content, to click on it, and then decide what button it goes into or what bucket of harassment it goes into. Those buckets, the way it's delineated, that is the design interpreting the policy, making it human readable, right? It's using content strategy and design to sort of separate it and summarize it in a way that hopefully most general users could understand. So it's taking the political infrastructure, the policy, what kind of harm, technical infrastructure, the actual ability to report, and fold it into the product design process, the online harassment reporting system. Security settings are another great example of this. For a user to report content, they shouldn't have to be a lawyer, and to adjust security settings, they shouldn't have to be an engineer. Design helps make complexities understandable to everyday people. If policy is a set of rules that roughly outline or govern how things work, then design policy is the act of using design to make policies around software and hardware understandable. It recognizes that design affects technology, including how technology looks and feels to consumers and what consumers can see or know about technology. Design policy, dark patterns, and new regulation all go hand in hand. Design policy should, in theory, alleviate dark patterns, but as I'm currently working on with a research fellow with the Information Commissioner's Office, it's a data protection regulator in the UK, it's much, much more complicated than that. There are some deeper issues with dark patterns, given how relatively unknown they are for policymakers. There's a reason that in this year, 2022, the ICO is starting to focus on this. There's a reason that other regulators are starting to focus on this. They've seen them popping up primarily with things like the GDPR, and are also recognizing that they're having to now tailor or create regulation and legislation towards things like dark patterns. But design is a harder thing at times to regulate because a lot of times design is contextual. Sebastian Reiger, the head of communication for Stiftung Neue Verantwortung, hypothesizes on this problem, quote, he says, whether it's the US or Germany, there's still little research available on dark patterns because for a long time they did not cause a lot of damage. But this has changed in the last few years. Today, across many industries, companies use digital design practices to harm consumers, erode privacy, and harm competition. Dark patterns, to my knowledge as a designer, have been talked about for a while, but it's only recently as it sort of made the jump into being studied by different academic labs and focused on by regulators, and also now finally covered by really big journalist entities and big articles, again, like ProPublica. And also, I think this is because with the rollout of the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, we saw some instances of dark patterns. Now, I know I'm speaking to a European audience, but in case there are people that are new to understanding GDPR, I'll just quickly explain it. The GDPR aims to roughly give control to individuals over their personal data and provide a unified regulatory block for companies across the EU. So why are we looking at GDPR? I think it's a great example of design policy. The interesting thing about GDPR is that it's a design problem as much as a policy one, because the GDPR has to take privacy settings and cookies and create user consent-focused flows in a way that's understandable to users, but also needs to provide a way to opt in and opt out and not radically slow down users, because that would be annoying. GDPR is also about a much bigger issue. How do we design for user consent and transparency in products and ad tracking? It's a pretty big deal. And since it's been passed, the GDPR was radically misinterpreted across platforms and websites. And I'm going to show you some different kinds of screens and warning labels I saw within the first 6 months of GDPR, because I was living in Germany at that time. So this is a popular conservative website in the United States. It doesn't even implement the GDPR. But we shouldn't be surprised, right? It's Fox News. This is illegal. I should have reported them. I didn't, and that is on me. So this was also what I saw in 2019. This is what some think tanks and watchdog groups would argue is probably illegal. Harper's Bazaar is only showing one thing you can do, which is accept, and they should be, in fact, ashamed of this. This is not consensual at all. Your choice is yes or do not read the website. This was taken in May 2019. But then I went back in April 2020 to look at this again, and Harper's Bazaar had changed it to this screenshot. Now, what you're seeing here is probably technically legal under GDPR, but they are implementing a dark pattern. Why do you think that is? Well, when we look at accept all cookies, it's a black button. It really pops out against that background, and it looks clickable and it looks big, right? Cookie settings looks like a hyperlink. But what if we clicked on cookie settings? What's underneath it? Yes, that is where the actual consensual, legible choice is. This is why it's a dark pattern. It's hidden under this step. And I think this is also important to sort of show that this is a content strategy dark pattern as well, where language and design create misinterpretations. It's important to note, again, that this technically fulfills the requirements of GDPR, but they are creating confusion for a user as to how to opt out. It looks like there's only one option. Is cookie settings as understandable as reject all? No. So content and copy, i.e. the writing in products, software, and apps, needs to be understandable, legible, and written in plain language so users understand the choices that are presented. And the actual UI design and graphic design needs to reflect that as well. So this could have been reject all, or we could have had just actually this setting right here, confirm my choices, reject all, allow all. And finally, GDPR implemented correctly. Thank you, The Atlantic. Some would even argue this is still a dark pattern because it's nudging you towards accept. I would say, I'm just glad that they're both the same size. But again, it is nudging you towards the less private option, which is important to keep in mind. And I'm showing you this to kind of build a case around how design has all these different kinds of implications. This was an example of designing for consent. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about designing for transparency. And one of the reasons I want to talk about that is that's a big theme I've seen pop up again and again around research related to responsible AI and explainable AI, along with people sort of hypothesizing and thinking about, well, what will the European AI bill look like? We've already seen the launch of a potential American AI bill. European regulation for AI is coming. It's been in the works for a while. And most likely transparency is going to be one of those big themes. Now, for me, I've spent the past few years thinking about, well, what is the definition of transparency that I would like to see out there? And I've brought it down to sort of three things of what I think people say or what they mean when they say they want transparency, which is legibility, the ability to understand what a system is doing so general users can understand. So it's not just designed for data scientists, it's designed for all of us to understand. The second one would be the ability to audit. So processes are laid out so legible that you can audit the process, and that there's a way for you to audit all the different steps. And the last one is spaces for impact or interaction. So you can take that audit and do something with it and get a response or a reaction. And that there's a clear and cohesive system of once you sort of submit that audit or you submit that request or you submit that different kind of statement you've said. And I think this is important, and this is where design can actually be useful in doing all of that to explain what's happening inside of an algorithm, a data model, or a product. So this is where I've been thinking a bit about data ratings and data ingredients, maybe data peer reviewed. The legibility is inspired by 18F's plain language guide to designing for the federal government and civil servants. Legibility is explaining in plain language what a product and algorithm is doing. Legibility can be showing or explaining what is in a data set. I call this data ingredients. Should data sets have ratings, explanations, readable labels? Should they expire even? I think that could be good, the sort of the expiring of data sets. Maybe we need this kind of information, right, placed inside of just a data set. And as I was saying earlier, drugs in the United States have approval processes. They are tested, food has ingredients, and calorie information listed. While this isn't perfect, should we be thinking about ratings and accountability for data? So what if algorithms also came with this kind of labeling? We've seen a lot of movement in this by different researchers, primarily Margaret Mitchell, Timit Jebru, who have published data sheets for data sets and model cards for models. But I think these need to be interpreted again to be much more legible for a general audience. Model cards work really, really well, especially if you're a data scientist. But we need to make these things much more legible again, so anyone could sort of look at a system and say, I think I understand what's going on. And so if you think this is a good idea, you're not alone. Again, lots of people have proposed similar things. Is this our data future? Perhaps it could be. Does this need a real graphic designer? It definitely does, because I'm a UX designer and a brutalist one at that, and not a graphic designer. So what is transparency in action? Let's imagine this framework moving forward. I'm going to tell you a funny side story. 2015, a boy who was really awful but had the hair of a Disney prince broke my heart, and I'm sure, as some of you have done here, I drowned my sorrows in music. And my Spotify drug of choice was Mumford & Sons, which is a band that no one should be proud to listen to. I can't believe I'm saying this recorded to you. And I don't even really like that band, but I was really brokenhearted. And I listened to every song that band had every day for a month on repeat. And you know what that did? It messed up my Discover Weekly. It destroyed my Discover Weekly. My Discover Weekly is still destroyed. And that was 7 years ago. And I was thinking about this the other day. This may seem innocuous and benign, but why can't I intervene in the algorithm in this product? Why can't I uplift or show what I'm interested in now? Why can't I say, these are the things I'm interested in? And this older data, this older version of Caroline, she doesn't like that stuff anymore. Why can't I do that with something that is an entertainment product, which is what this is? Why can't I do that with Netflix, right? Why can't I do that with other things too on social media? Why can't I do that with Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or TikTok? And I know I'm not alone in that. But I may be an unusual user. I may not be a general user, but I do wish that I could fine tune this more. So this is a provocation I've been thinking about, of how do you take these labels and put transparency in action? And I'm not alone. Again, as I've mentioned, there's a lot of papers coming out. And there's also this great project I'm a big fan of called the Data Nutrition Project by Kaja Chemlinski, Sarah Newman, Matt Taylor, Kimmy Thomas, Chris Kranziger, Karine Terezu, and H.D. King. And they've been thinking about what could these more robust data ingredients look like for neural language models. They have a whole paper they've written. They have a lot of different interfaces, and I recommend that you look at it. And this multi-year project was supported by Consumer Reports, really looking at, again, how data labels are needed for different data sets used by an AI model. And we need this kind of legibility and understanding to really make AI more user-friendly. Which brings me to a project I just worked on, designing for social media recommendation algorithm transparency with the Center for Democracy and Technology. We just had a paper come out. I will send it over to Phil, so you have it. He can share out the link. And I worked with Mikkel Lura and Shesset Gebrut in terms of taking different kinds of user research Mikkel had done and trying to craft what those users wanted into a series of a transparencies report that is interactive. So we made these prototypes And again, this was based off user research Mikkel did with the Center for Democracy and Technology team. And so we wanted to take different desires that users had around the kinds of interactive interfaces they wanted. They wanted to understand how their data was used, and they wanted ways to remove data, and they wanted to be specific. They didn't want positive speak, and they didn't want generic speak, like general speak. They wanted things really rooted in their data. So we pulled the different kinds of data points you see here out of research out of a lit review out of a lit review that looked at how different kinds of data was maybe divided or subdivided inside of social networks already. So this is pulling out of what users requested and a robust lit review. This first page is designed to show people what they're spending their time on and also give an analytical overview. And it's so granular because we're hoping the idea is to guide users through things they've already done to ground them in this information. So they can start to understand what it is they're seeing. They may not remember they posted 600 comments, but they may remember in this time period that they were posting a lot. They'll probably remember 10 accounts they started to follow, or 3 different countries they visited, or the new followers they gained, and they may have a little bit of a sense of what they're looking at. So part of this page is so granular is to remind them of what happened in that time period, and then also teach them like the interface of the tool and how the tool is working. So when you see things like conversations in groups and how much time they spent interacting with friends, posts, and ads, we're trying to reveal that on this granular level. And we're then also grounding them in this hard data that they know, like their name, their location, their age, etc., things they've already given the company, because then we can start to show them where these inferences come from. And the inferences are the assumptions that the recommendation algorithm model is building. Which leads us to prototype 2, which is inferences about their experience. In this case, there are some examples of hard data, like showing someone's location. But once you click on something else, like political affiliation, this is where we start to see the inferences. And this is where I mean that granular breakdown, again, of mimicking a design interface that we've seen before. We're trying to ground them in this thing they're already starting to learn, that already starts to feel familiar. So we look at this one, which is political affiliation. They may remember joining a group, but maybe they don't remember all the content they've clicked on, or all the comments they left, but they may remember some of the URLs that they've read. We are grounding them in a sense in the scale of data. Ideally, they would hover on these different things. You'd be able to click and go to another page and see a more granular breakdown. So they could actually see these 83 positive comments, for example. And again, they may not directly realize that they were, clicking on something related to political affiliation, but we're grounding them in these different kinds of data, again, like these groups around political ads, like URLs they've read, and we're trying to show what makes that inference of political affiliation. We're trying to also show, like, well, what is this data now in context, right? This is how this data is used. That's the context of it now. And there's another prototype we made, and that sort of data in context is true of the plug and play. And this is part of the design. And part of the inspiration comes from my time at IBM Watson, where we would make a lot of playable demos, a lot of plug and play, to sort of show people how different algorithmic models we had made, like how they actually function and what a product could be on top of it. And from our time there, we actually found it really helpful in terms of showing, explaining, and selling different kinds of algorithms, because it let people take on the initiative and try without having to be a programmer. It really let them sort of see really quickly, like, what was happening and how the data could be interpreted, and lets them see how the algorithm functions inside of a product. And this is kind of the same idea here, showing things to a person that they've already seen. So if it's your plug and play, which is what would be on the left where it says New York, these are ads you've actually seen, but you can also see that they're tied to your location, right? Like the Bronx Zoo, like MoMA. And they can see how that's related to their data. And then if they go click, if they change their location, let's say they change it to Buenos Aires, they can then see how the ads start to change, right? And they can see again how this sort of small change has this deeper impact on the algorithmic model. And again, this is sort of fast, interactive, and lightweight, but it's a way to show people some of the basics thing of how the algorithm functions. And interaction is a great way to sort of teach and show people without having to overly use language, for example. And this is the last one of the most important ones, I think, and it's also one of the most speculative ones. I think it's the most important to recommend, which is allowing people to move allowing them to move and control how their data is interacted with. It's also showing how different data is gathered by social media algorithms. Maybe data is gathered from content like news sources and academic behavioral data and advertising data, and then how the behavior of their actual account, and the account similar to yours and websites you visited. And we really wanted to show all of that so they could get a sense of these different kinds of data. But as you scroll down the page, you can see how, so the inputting data affects the model, and then you see this outgoing data. And the outgoing data in the black corner is things that will never be shared. So, there are things that are never leaving the platform, but you can move other things into that section. You could move all of these data points into that section. But it really allows the user to say, this is what I want shared, this is what I don't want shared. And this is also maybe what I want shared to academics or to trusted partners, or this is what I want shared very publicly, right? And it's also allowing the user to enact their own opinion and their own agency, their own desires of how their data is affected. And this is what I think is transparency in action. And this is the part I think we need to start illustrating with how algorithmic models work across any product, because people should have an opinion on how their data is accessed and also have a way to directly inform and impact that model. Similar to my Spotify example, we need to allow users to impact or affect the model by saying, this is the information I care about. This is the inferences I want you to pull from. These are the kinds of recommendations I'd like to see. And this is the kind of stuff I'd like deleted and not accessed. And as you see at the very bottom of this, or back on this page, all the way down here, you can delete everything. Thank you. I know I gave a whistle-stop tour, but thank you so much for your time. And I really wish I could be there. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I will be available over email. And maybe potentially text, depending upon how I'm feeling when this is shown tomorrow. But thank you so much. I'm Caroline Sinders. I'm an artist and researcher, and I care deeply about how to make AI more explainable and more legible to everyday audiences. So thank you so much.
So it's a real shame that we can't ask Caroline questions in person, but please do take the opportunity to email her. I'm going to abuse my position because she doesn't get to speak to just say it's really nice to see this really detailed look at personal data and how we see things going from pixels to policies, but also back from policies to pixels and the different routes and directions for things there, and how some of these ideas of multiple identities are not just other people, but they're yourself at different times. So we get a window into the complex relationships we have with our personal data.